Nazi propaganda to the Arab world during World War II and the emergence of Islamism by Jeffrey Herf. In my recent book, Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, I offered evidence and argument regarding the connection between Nazism and Islamism during World War II and the Holocaust. Islamism has a longer history than Nazism, but one of its important chapters took place during World War II in Nazi Germany. It is this modern tradition and not the religion of Islam that stands at the center of what Robert Wistrich has rightly called the shift in the center of gravity in the locus of anti-Semitism from its European roots to the Arab, Iranian, and Islamic world since the middle of the 20th century. After summarizing the arguments of my recent book, I will discuss a recently discovered speech by Haj Amin el-Husseini delivered in Baludan, Syria in 1937, and some of his post-1945 essays and speeches. I will contrast Husseini's success in post-1945 Palestinian nationalist and Arab nationalist politics with the success of one of his former associates in wartime Berlin, Kurt Georg Kiesinger. In post-war West German politics. Footnote. The contrast illuminates the shift of gravity I just mentioned. In this context, it is worth mentioning a memo written in 1952 by Manfred Halpern. Halpern, the author of The Politics of Social Change in the Middle East, taught Middle East politics at Princeton University from 1959 to 1994. From 1948 to 1958, he worked at the Near East desk of the U.S. State Department. In a Halpern memo I found in the U.S. National Archives, Halpern wrote one of the most extensive, articulate, and perhaps ignored warnings of a current of ideas he called, quote, neo-Islamic totalitarianism, end quote, that he saw in the Muslim Brotherhood and related Islamist currents. See, quote, Islam is a barrier to communism in the Arab world. February 21st, 1952, NARA Intelligence Reports, 1941 to 1961, Department of State, M1221, Microfilm Subject Index, Muslims Intelligence Report 5472, end footnote. The main argument of Nazi propaganda for the Arab world is the following. During World War II, and especially between 1941 and 1945, a fateful political and ideological collaboration took place in Nazi Berlin. The participants included, on the one hand, an entourage of Arab nationalists and Islamists led by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin el-Husseini, as well as Rashid el-Kilani, the former head of a pro-Axis government in Iraq overthrown by British invasion in May-June 1941. The Arab and Islamist exiles arrived in Berlin in November 1941, where they met with Hitler and Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. As is well known, in a meeting on November 28, 1941, Hitler promised Husseini that in the event of an Axis victory on the southern parts of the Eastern Front in Europe, as well as in North America, he would extend the final solution to the Jews residing in North Africa and the Middle East. The fate of these Jews now depended on the outcome of the battles between the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front, especially the Battle of Stalingrad, as well as the outcome of the battles in North Africa, especially those in Al-Alamein and later in Tunisia. Both Husseini, who had expressed his enthusiasm for the Nazi regime since 1933, mostly via private communications with German officials, and Kilani eagerly offered to assist the Nazi regime in the best way they could, namely by placing themselves in their entourage of native Arab speakers who were familiar with both Islam and local Arab politics, at the disposal of the Nazi regime's Arabic language print operation, and especially its shortwave Arabic language radio broadcast aimed at North Africa and the Middle East. The center of this collaboration lay in the division of the German Foreign Office responsible the divisions of the German Foreign Office responsible for foreign language broadcasting. Working together, the Orient experts in Berlin, Fritz, Grobe, Werner von Hentig, Wilhelm Melchers, and Kurt Munzel, Husseini, the popular announcer Jonas Bari, and others created something new. Together, the Nazis and the pro-Nazi Arab collaborators produced a cultural fusion, a synthesis that brought together the anti-Western, anti-democratic, and vehemently anti-Semitic currents of National Socialism and radical Arab nationalism, infused with an equally radical Islamist reading of the traditions of Islam. British and American diplomats in the Middle East were aware of the resulting broadcasts from, quote, Radio Berlin and, quote, the voice of free Arabism. One diplomat in particular, the American ambassador to Egypt, Alexander Kirk, played a decisive role in creating a remarkable documentary record of the results of this collaboration. Beginning in the spring of 1942, not long after Husseini had arrived in Berlin, Kirk began to send weekly verbatim English-language transcripts of, quote, Axis broadcasts in Arabic to the office of the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, then from 1944, Edward Stettinius, in Washington. The resulting several thousand pages were declassified in 1977. This remarkable and unique record of a founding moment of Islamism remained either unread or unused by scholars of the Middle East and World War II until I came across it in June of 2007. The evidence in Nazi propaganda for the Arab world represented a significant advance in our knowledge of a vital chapter in the longer history of Islamism. Its key points are as follows. First, throughout World War II, the Nazi regime's broadcast rested in part on a highly selective reading of the Quran and the traditions of Islam. Nazi propaganda presented the Third Reich as a friend of Islam as it chose to interpret Islam. This elective affinity rested on shared antipathies to liberal democracy, Western individualism, the Allies in World War II, Britain, the Soviet Union, and after December 1941, the United States as well, Zionism and the Jews. It is important to note that Nazi propaganda made no distinction at all between Zionism and Jews. Both perhaps the Germans and Arab exiles in Berlin opposed Zionism because they also hated Jews as Jews and saw any Jewish state in Palestine as incompatible with the demands of Islam as they understood the demands of Islam. The secular appeals to oppose the Allies in World War II and to oppose Zionism were inseparable from a religious argument about the supposedly inherently anti-Jewish character of Islam. German officials in the foreign ministry concluded that this kind of appeal that connected to Islamist themes was far more effective than arguments from Hitler's Mein Kampf or Goebbels' speeches. Second, Nazi propaganda in German informed the German listeners that the Nazi regime was in the process of, quote, annihilating and, quote, exterminating Europe's Jews to take revenge on a people that it claimed had launched a war of extermination against the Germans. As Nazi Germany's Arabic language broadcasts were beamed to areas where the German armies had not yet seized control of areas where most Jews were living, their message, voiced by Husseini and other unnamed announcers, was for listeners to take matters into their own hands and to, quote, kill the Jews themselves. Nazi broadcast accused the Jews of having started World War II in order to create a Jewish state not only in Palestine, but from the, quote, Nile to the Euphrates, and of seeking to wipe out the Arabs and destroy the religion of Islam. They adapted the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of the, quote, protocols of the elders of Zion to the political and religious themes of the Arab and Islamic context. In spreading such conspiracy theories and in making explicit appeals for listeners to engage in mass murder, the broadcasts themselves were actions that in the Nuremberg successor trials of German officials working on German language propaganda had been defined as war crimes and crimes against humanity. According to Article 3 of the United Nations 1948 Convention on the Prevention of Genocide, they fit the term of the clause that defined, quote, incitement to mass murder part of the crime of genocide. Third, in addition to the broadcasts themselves, the files of the German Foreign Office, the British Embassy in wartime Cairo, American embassies and consulates in the Middle East, the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, and American military intelligence all came to roughly the same conclusions regarding the impact of Nazi Germany's Arabic language propaganda. It was enthusiastically welcomed by a distinct group of political and intellectual figures in the Muslim Brotherhood, some army officers in Egypt and Iraq, some faculty and students at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, and probably in other universities and affiliates of the Brotherhood elsewhere in the region. Both the Germans and the Allies agreed that Nazi Germany's opposition to Zionism helped its cause, while the Allies perceived support was a hindrance to gaining Arab and Muslim adherents. Though there were also Arab political figures who supported the Allies, the outcome of the war in Europe and especially in North Africa exerted a powerful influence on Arab and Muslim opinion. Had the Germans won the Battle of Alamein in 1942, it is likely they would have found some collaborators in the above-mentioned circles. The American and British assessment of the question of impact and reception was carefully balanced. Both Alexander Kirk and British Ambassador Miles Lampson avoided generalizations about, quote, the Arabs or, quote, the Muslims. Alexander Kirk and Miles Lampson spoke instead of specific groups and individuals and saw to it that tens of thousands of individuals were arrested as posing a, quote, fifth column threat during the war. Fourth, the evidence regarding the impact and reception of Nazi propaganda excludes its after effects in the years following World War II. In the summer of 1945, the OSS experts for the regime concluded that there was no support in the Middle East to indict Husseini and other Arabs and Islamist collaborators with the Nazi regime for war crimes or crimes against humanity. The cause of this lack of enthusiasm lay in the view that collaboration was due to opposition to the British presence in the region, and also to a widespread opposition to Zionism. Not all opposition to Zionism was driven by hatred of the Jews, but the broad anti-Zionist mood in the Middle East meant that anti-Semites such as Husseini were not precluded from assuming positions of leadership in the post-war years. Indeed, upon Husseini's return to Cairo in 1946, Hassan al-Banna, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, extolled the Mufti. Hitler and Mussolini said al-Banna were gone, but the Mufti would continue the struggle. That is, al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood saw the fight against the effort to establish a Jewish state in Palestine after 1945 as part of the same, quote, struggle that Husseini had waged in wartime Berlin when he collaborated with the Nazi regime. Sayyid Qutb, the leading ideologist of the Brotherhood, published a viciously anti-Semitic essay in 1950 or 1951 entitled, quote, Our Struggle with the Jews. The essay integrates the standard conspiracy theories of European anti-Semitism with an anti-Semitic reading of classic Islamic texts and also asserts that Allah sent Hitler to earth to, quote, punish the Jews. We do not know if Qutb read a leaflet produced by the SS in 1944 that suggested exactly the same thing, but, quote, Our Struggle with the Jews offers further powerful evidence that the cultural fusion of wartime Berlin found a powerful echo in Islamist circles in the Middle East after the war. Nazi propaganda for the Arab world has been well received by scholars of both Nazi Germany and by some scholars of the Middle East, who view it as a turning point that greatly expands our previously inadequate knowledge of Nazi Arabic propaganda for the Middle East. The scholarly reply from the mainstream of scholars of the Middle East is yet to come, but there are indications that the presentations of this evidence does not meet with unanimous delight. Indeed, Tarif Khalidi, without having read the book, wrote to the editors of the Times literary supplement to denounce it as a piece of Israeli propaganda. More informal responses suggest that there will be those who insist that it had no impact, that Haj Amin el-Husseini was a marginal figure, and that the real reason anti-Semitism has spread to the Middle East is because the State of Israel was established in 1948. Lurking in these arguments is the idea, rarely stated publicly, that anti-Semitism, when coming from Arabs, Islamists, or Iranians, is understandable, that is, excusable response to the sins of Zionism, and thus is not worthy of the same kind of moral criticism that is applied to Jew hatred in its European context. I mean, that's absolutely true. I am, in fact, just reading a book by that was the edited volume of Critical Theory and the Critique of Anti-Semitism, and one of the things was saying, is just like, kind of like, explaining, there's kind of like a tacit thing of like, explaining a worldview and justifying a worldview at the same time. So, like, you wouldn't really do that with Nazism. You wouldn't explain the tenets of Nazism and then in a way that was kind of like, let's listen to it in context, usually trying to mix explanation with justification. But you definitely see that if anti-Semitism or reactionary ideas come from people who also happen to have a history of being dominated by either white supremacy or imperialism. So, for instance, in the thing that I was just reading, it was a piece by someone who's just saying, more or less kind of like using like James Baldwin's kind of explanation of black anti-Semitism as like, because Jews are just kind of viewed as white, and they're, they benefit from the white establishment as like a justification for their hostility to Jews. Is this like, if Jews were accepted to some extent within a society that might have otherwise excluded them, and that society still excludes others, then that makes Jews a worthy target of rage, or a legitimate target of rage. It was like very much like taking, it seemed to me, I mean, I haven't read the piece of James Baldwin, and in other aspects I really like James Baldwin, but this kind of like critical, this kind of like idea of like, oh, well, there's a reason for this kind of like really, really historically violent form of prejudice that's in some sense justified because, X, Y, and Z. The Jews really are actually guilty of something. So, anti-Semitism's not just explained, but kind of given a justification. Anyway, what we would call the excuse of third worldism interprets Arab collaboration with the Nazi regime as again an understandable aspect of a basically legitimate opposition to British imperialism and Zionism, one in which the Arab and Islamist collaborators somehow found themselves drawn into the world of Nazism. In fact, the evidence in my book and those of other recent works is more than sufficient to confirm the active enthusiasm with which Husseini and his colleagues tried to help Nazi Germany win World War II and fan the flames of Jew hatred. However, since the publication of this work, further evidence regarding the impact, reception, and after effects of Nazi Germany's Arab language propaganda has emerged. The German political scientist and contemporary historian Matthias Kunzel has found additional evidence from Haj Amin el-Husseini that Haj Amin el-Husseini had produced one of Islamism's founding texts well before he came to Berlin in 1941. Footnote. See Matthias Kunzel, Das Erbe des Mufti in Tribuna Zeitschrift zum Verständnis des Judentums. I am grateful to Kunzel for bringing this document to my attention. He will be publishing a study that includes work on the text and context in which it was written. On Husseini in the years before and in Berlin, see Zeni Lebel, Haj Amin el-Husseini and National Socialism. Yeah, I want to just say something just like about like these like backgrounds, like both. I don't know if Matthias Kunzel and Jeffrey Herf knew each other at the time, but I believe that they were both operating in Berlin and were definitely part of like definitely Matthias Kunzel is definitely part of the German radical left. I don't know what his relationship to it is now. I think he definitely does give talks when like, I don't know, German anti-fascist students like have talks about racism and prejudice. But Jeffrey Herf translated the book, one of the Alfred Schmidt of the Frankfurt School's books into English on Marx. And he also has had works in other journals that were relevant to critical theory and wrote on critical theory. So I don't know if how long they've known each other or what their relationship is or how they like today like relate to left-wing politics, if they do at all. But it's telling that they that they both kind of emerge out of this kind of like critical left milieu. I don't know what the importance of it is, but it's interesting and it's suggestive. Okay, end of that footnote. While avoiding arrest by British authorities, Husseini organized an all-Arab conference of 400 delegates on September 8th to 9th, 1937, in Buladan, Syria. Footnote. On Husseini and the Buludan Conference, see Zvi Elpeleg, the Grand Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, founder of the Palestinian National Movement, translated David Harvey, edited by Shmuel Himmelstein, London, Frank Cass, 1993. The 400 delegates included unofficial representatives from Arab countries and 124 Palestinian Arabs. At the end of the conference, the delegates elected Husseini the conference's honorary president. In Husseini's absence, one of his texts was read to those in attendance. So, end of footnote. In Husseini's absence, one of his texts was read to those in attendance. The following year, a text by Husseini entitled, quote, Islamism and the Jews, was published in German by Juncker and Dunhaupt of Berlin, in a work entitled Islam, Jewry, Bolshevism, edited by Mohammed Sabri. Sabri's work appeared in a series on, quote, the idea and form of National Socialism, end quote. The German text of Husseini's piece had the subtitle, quote, The Grand Mufti's Appeal to the Islamic World in 1937. It is most likely the same text delivered to the delegates in Buludan in September 1937. Quote, Islam and the Jews offered a remarkably elaborate reading of the Quran that placed Jew hatred in a millennial time span and applied it to modern times as well. Its publication in a German edition in 1938 in Berlin meant that Husseini's distinctively Islamist Jew hatred could be known by those in the German government and academic circles who followed developments in the Arab world. Kunzel reports that an Arabic edition was presumably widely distributed in the Middle East, thus constituting an early step in the diffusion of Jew hatred with Islamist textual reference. Here are some key passages. Quote, "The battle between Jews and Islam began when Muhammad fled from Mecca to Medina. ... Therefore, they were seized by a deep hatred against Islam. The hatred intensified the stronger and more powerful Islam became. ... In those days, the Jewish methods were exactly the same as they are today. Then as now, slander was their weapon. They said Muhammad was a swindler. ... They tried to undermine his honor. ... They began to pose senseless and unanswerable questions to Muhammad. ... And then they tried to annihilate the Muslims. Just as the Jews were able to betray Muhammad, so the Jews will betray the Muslims today. ... The verses of the Quran and the Hadith assert that the Jews were Islam's most bitter enemy, and moreover try to destroy it." End quote. Husseini. Kunzel views Husseini's text as a, quote, innovation, because, quote, in classic Islamic literature, Muhammad's fight with the Jews was generally viewed as a minor episode in the life of the Prophet, end quote. And over time, quote, the anti-Jewish passages in the Quran and Hadith were largely forgotten, end quote. Husseini, however, quote, began to ascribe a really cosmic importance to the Prophet's supposedly hostile view of the Jews in Medina, end quote. Husseini selected various passages from the Quran and brought them together with European anti-Semitic visions of a Jewish world conspiracy. Bassam Tibi has referred to Islamism as an invented tradition. Husseini's text from the Baludan Conference in 1937 was one of its founding moments. Footnote: Bassam Tibi, Islam Between Culture and Politics. End footnote. This radicalization and reshaping of past traditions, though not identical to the radicalization of European Christianity by Nazi ideologists, was a parallel project that placed a particular reading of a massive religious tradition in the service of a contemporary hatred of the Jews. Husseini's, quote, Islam and the Jews, articulated well before he arrived in Berlin, was not a result of the impact of an external force, Nazism with Husseini a passive receptor. To be sure, the general climate of radical anti-Semitism coming from the most powerful state on the European continent had an impact on ideological currents inside and beyond Europe. Yet Husseini's text of 1937 and 1938 is evidence that Islamism, as a distinct political ideology, had begun to take shape as a result of his own intellectual labors and those of other Islamist radicals in the 1930s. In wartime Berlin, Husseini and his Nazi counterparts learned from one another how best to fuse Islamist Jew hatred with the modern conspiracy theories of Nazi and European anti-Semitism. The ranting on the radio to, quote, kill the Jews was one result of this fusion of different cultural traditions of hatred. Though there is much more research to be done on the after effects of Nazi propaganda and the post-war history of Islamist ideology, a comparison of two ex-Nazis, one in Europe and another in the Middle East, is illuminating. It is plausible that between 1941 and 1945, Haj Amin al-Husseini met Kurt Georg Kiesinger, the director of the Department of Radio Policy in the German Foreign Ministry from 1943 to 1945. After the war, Kiesinger spent several months interned by the Allies. In 1948, a denazification court acquitted him of involvement in war crimes. He was one of the thousands of former Nazi officers and party members who were reintegrated into West German society and public life with remarkable indeed unseemly haste. Footnote. See Philip Gasser, Kurt Georg Kiesinger, 1904 to 1988. Kanzler zwischen den Zeiten. Another footnote. On the reintegration process, see Norbert Frye's Adenauer's Germany and the Nazi Past, translated by Joel Golb. End footnote. After the war, Kiesinger saw which way the wind was blowing and changed his political opinions. Kiesinger understood that Nazism was a major political tradition was finished in post-war Europe. As so many millions of other ex-Nazis, Kiesinger quickly discovered the blessings of liberal democracy, the Western alliance, and the containment of communism with a timely mixture of opportunism and disillusionment. With equal speed, Kiesinger was able to offer a story of his years in the Third Reich that placed the blame for crimes on others, and Kiesinger left unmentioned episodes such as Nazi Germany's Arabic propaganda programs described in my book. Kiesinger's election to the German parliament only 4 years after the Nazi regime was defeated began a political career at national, state, and again national level that culminated in Kiesinger's election as the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1966. Yet, for all the bitter irony with which one may regard Kiesinger's post-war political career, his success as a politician presupposed that he had publicly abandoned his convictions of the Nazi era and did not advocate either violent anti-Semitism or dictatorship. Had Kiesinger continued to advocate Nazism, he would not have had a political career in post-war German politics and would certainly not have become chancellor. Nazism was part of his biography, not his post-war politics. After the war, Haj Amin al-Husseini, like Kiesinger, did not change his views. Moreover, Husseini did not have to change those views as a precondition for continued political prominence. Footnote. On Husseini's essays and interviews from the 1950s, see the important collection Through the Eyes of the Mufti, Essays of Haj Amin, translated and annotated by Zvi Elpeleg, English translation by Rachel Cassell. End footnote. In the decade following the end of World War II, Husseini remained the most important leader of the Palestinian national movement. From 1946 on, after Husseini's return to the region, the Arab Higher Committee, AHC, functioned again in Palestine. In the words of Edward Said, the Arab Higher Committee was, quote, chaired by Palestine's national leader, Haj Amin al-Husseini, end quote. Under Haj Amin al-Husseini's leadership, the organization, quote, represented the Palestinian Arab National Consensus, had the backing of the Palestinian political parties that functioned in Palestine, had and was recognized in some form by Arab governments as the voice of the Palestinian people until the Palestine Liberation Organization acquired its representative character, end quote. Edward Said, Profile of the Palestinians. in Edward Said and Christopher Hitchens, blaming the victims, spurious scholarship, and the Palestinian. Given Edward Said's famous attack on Orientalism, it seems safe to assume that his assertion of Husseini's centrality in the Palestinian, quote, national consensus is not due to unfounded generalizations from the British Foreign Office, the U.S. State Department, or various scholars supposedly advocating what Said called an Orientalist or Zionist, quote, narrative. End footnote. In 1948, the Palestine National Council meeting in Gaza unanimously chose Husseini to be its president, putting Husseini at the head of the leading organization of Palestinian nationalism and the precursor of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was founded in 1964. Footnote. On Husseini in the years following World War II, see Elpeleg, Supernote 3, pages 79 to 118. End footnote. Husseini rejected all efforts to reach a compromise with the Jews in Palestine and played a central role in organizing units to engage in what he called, quote, the, quote, holy jihad, his term for the Arab war on the new state of Israel in 1948. Husseini's political preeminence and his ascendancy over moderate Palestinians constitute powerful evidence that at very least Husseini's partisanship for Nazism and his broadcast hatred for the Jews and Zionism during World War II did not disqualify Husseini from continued participation in political life. The ideological fusion between Nazism and Islamism examined in my book, an ideology that he helped to fashion in wartime Berlin, thus had a second life in the Middle East. From the 1930s to the 1950s, Husseini's visceral hatred of the Jews remained at the core of his worldview. In post-war Europe, despite many myths regarding who did or who did not support or oppose Nazism and fascism, and despite a post-war era in which too much was forgotten and too many criminals escaped timely judicial reckoning, Nazism and Jew hatred from which it was inseparable, Nazism and the Jew hatred from which Nazism was inseparable ceased to be dominant factors in the mainstream of European politics. Footnote. On post-war European myth-making, see Jeffrey Herf, Divided Memory, the Nazi Past in the Two Germanys, and Tony Judt, Post-War, A History of Europe Since 1945, and Henry Rousseau, The Vichy Syndrome, History and Memory in France Since 1944. Husseini's prominence indicates that anti-Semitism did not have a comparable disqualifying impact in areas of Palestinian and Arab politics after 1945. Husseini and his apologists clothed and excused his hatred of Jews as being an apparently justified response to the creation of the State of Israel, the Zionist project as a whole, and imperialism and colonialism more generally. Yet the evidence clearly indicates that Husseini's Jew hatred preceded World War II and persisted afterwards. Moreover, Klaus Genzeke's important recent work on Husseini's years in Nazi Berlin, and Martin Kupper's and Klaus Michael Malmann's study of the Nazi policy toward North Africa and the Middle East have brought further archival and interpretive depth to our understanding of the intersection of Nazism and Islamism in these critical years. The ideological synthesis that was broadcast over Nazi radio during World War II remained intact as Husseini won the support of a significant part of Palestinian and Arab sentiment. Indeed, the slogans of anti-imperialism facilitated the survival, in a different political and cultural context, of the fusion of Nazism and Islamism described in my book. In the fall of 2009, the English translation of Svi Elpoleg's Through the Eyes of the Mufti, Essays of Haj Amin, was published. The book is a collection of Husseini's essays and interviews from the 1950s that were initially published in Arabic in various newspapers. The texts are striking evidence of the continuity of Husseini's views from the 1930s and the Baludan text through the Berlin years and then into the post-World War II decade. He expressed no regret for having collaborated with Nazi Germany. Though Husseini treats the Berlin years with discreet silence, the Husseini of the mid-1950s echoed at times in the exact same phrases the Husseini of 1941 to 45. Just as Husseini and his colleagues in Berlin during World War II combined secular and religious themes and placed anti-colonialism in an Islamist context, so the post-war Palestinian leader prayed that, quote, the jihad of Palestine and the jihad of the Arab nation for liberty and independence, end quote, would be victorious. As he put it in July 1954, quote, Allah hears and answers those who call him, and he is the best ally and the best supporter, end quote. Haj Amin al-Husseini, the truth, quote, the truth concerning the Palestinian problem, in Through the Eyes of the Mufti. In Berlin, he and his fellow Arab collaborators made no distinction between attacks on Zionism and attacks on Jews in 1954, Husseini wrote that, quote, our battle was with, quote, world Jewry and its colonialist allies. Footnote, Haj Amin al-Husseini, quote, the enemies spread false propaganda and misleading rumors, end footnote. This battle was, quote, a question of life and death, a battle between two conflicting faiths, each of which can only exist on the ruins of the other, end quote. Haj Amin al-Husseini, the solutions presented by Britain were a chain of deceit, end footnote. In Berlin, the Arabic language broadcast referred to the Jews as a powerful and evil force. In the mid-1950s, Husseini wrote that, quote, when the Second World War broke out, the Jews had an opportunity to gather strength, increase their numbers of weapons, multiply their military force, and establish a Jewish army with the help of the British authorities, end quote. Footnote, Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Arab higher authority, objected to the Arab exodus from Palestine, end footnote. In wartime Berlin, Nazism's Arabic language propaganda denounced the United States because of the United States' support for the Jews and asserted that it did so because of the greater power of the Jews in the United States. In an essay in the newspaper Al-Mizri in 1954, Husseini wrote that over 5 million Jews in the United States had, quote, permeated all aspects of life, the press, the radio, and other means of propaganda, as well as economic and political circles, end quote. In Berlin, Nazi propaganda spoke of elective affinities between Protestantism and Judaism. In 1954, Husseini also drew attention to Protestant support for Israel. Haj Amin al-Husseini, the position of the United States on the Palestinian problem. In 1954, Husseini offered versions of German history that were identical to those of the Nazis. During World War II, Nazi propaganda claimed that the regime's attacks on the Jews were acts of revenge for past and present harm the Jews had supposedly done to Germany. See Jeffrey Herf, The Jewish Enemy, Nazi Propaganda During World War II and the Holocaust. In post-war Cairo, Husseini wrote that, quote, the Jews fulfilled a central role in acts of sabotage and destructive propaganda within Germany, end quote. Toward the end of World War I, and that, quote, they did so, quote, they did whatever they could to lead to Germany's destruction. This is the main reason for Hitler's war against the Jews and his strong antipathy towards the Jews. The Jews brought disaster upon Germany and led to Germany's defeat. Although Germany was the most powerful nation from a military point of view, Germany's revenge against the Jews was harsh, and it annihilated millions of them during the Second World War. In this way, the Jews' aspirations in Palestine and their acts against Germany during the First World War, aimed at achieving the Balfour Declaration, became the main reason for the disaster that befell the Jews during the Second World War. End quote. Fucking Jesus Christ. Haj Amin al-Husseini, the goal of the Zionist movement, to establish a Jewish state in Palestine and in the neighboring Arab countries to build Jewish temple in place of the Dome of the Rock at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. End footnote. In these remarkable sentences, Husseini did not deny that the Nazi regime, quote, annihilated millions of Jews during the war. Husseini presented this, quote, disaster that somehow, quote, befell the Jews as justified punishment for what they had supposedly done to Germany, as well as for their effort to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. This was not Holocaust denial, it was Holocaust justification. Footnote. On these themes, see Meir Litvak and Esther Webman, From Empathy to Denial, Arab Responses to the Holocaust, published by Columbia University Press in 2009. Okay, where am I? Conclusion. In order for historical scholarship on the shift of gravity in the history of anti-Semitism from Europe to the Middle East and Iran to advance, which is not to say that anti-Semitism has ceased to be an issue in Europe, it is essential that scholars who are able to read Arabic, Farsi, and/or Hebrew build on the work of Meir Litvak, Esther Webman, and others. In the aftermath of the Arab Spring of 2011, one hopes that the archives of Arab governments, relevant organizations, and centers of intellectual life, including the universities, will be open and made accessible to scholars. In February 1952, Manfred Halpern, then working on the State Department's Middle East desk, wrote a report entitled, quote, Islam as a Barrier to Communism in the Arab World. He did not think it would be a barrier. In this report of over 80 pages, Halpern wrote the following about the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood. Quote, unable, despite the grandiose visions of its program, to solve the basic issues of westernized modern life, technical and economic progress, peaceful relations among rival sovereignties, and the reconciliation of freedom with security, Neo-Islamic totalitarianism is forced by the logic of its own position and dynamics to pursue its goals through nihilistic terror, cunning, and passion. Like fascism, its movement represents the institutionalization of constant struggle and extreme tension. End quote. Footnote. Islam is a barrier to communism in the Arab world, February 21st, 1952. NARA intelligence reports. End quote. Halpern did not discuss the issue of anti-Semitism, but in 1952, at least one analyst in the State Department had grasped key elements of the cultural fusion that had taken place in wartime Berlin and the Middle East. Before and since 9/11, too many of the experts on the modern Middle East have not wanted to pursue Halpern's insights. Hopefully, the burst of recent scholarship on Nazism, Islamism, and anti-Semitism will encourage a young generation of scholars willing and able to do just that. Thanks for listening.